Okay, so these are the notes for chapter 8 in the Wholes Essentials of Human Anatomy and Physiology. This is on the skeletal muscle system. So we're starting a whole new chapter. And we're going to just cover the introduction, structure of the skeletal muscle, all the way down to the sarcomere, and also cover the neuromuscular junction today in this first lecture. So the muscular system, one of its main functions is to produce movement of the body. And to do that, for humans, we have to use our skeletal muscles. A muscle in itself, like if you've ever heard someone say make a muscle, that is considered an organ. It's not like what students traditionally think of, like usually think, oh, the heart, oh, the stomach, but a skeletal muscle is an organ. So your bicep is an organ. Your tricep is a separate organ. Muscles use a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy for us to move around. So we get that energy from our food. So nutrients that we eat go through our digestive system, get broken down, transported to your muscles. And then your muscles turn that into chemical energy in the form of ATP. And the ATP is used to contract the muscle, move your bones, which in turn moves the whole body. Muscles, they also provide you with muscle tone. They help move your body fluids around and also your food. So actually, skeletal muscles actually like move your blood back up to your heart, like in your lower extremities, because arteries and veins don't pump blood. And because they use so much energy, a byproduct of skeletal muscles is body heat. So that's how we are considered warm-blooded animals, is because we make our own body heat as a byproduct from muscles. And actually, if you get too cold, you will shiver, which is an involuntary reflex of all your skeletal muscles contracting rapidly to produce heat to warm you up. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, if you remember back from our chapter on tissues. We're going to focus mainly on the skeletal here, but we will touch on smooth muscle and cardiac muscle a little bit, and we'll get to cardiac a little bit more when we talk about the cardiovascular system. So each muscle, again, it's an organ. If you remember back from chapter 1, an organ is composed of several different tissues working together to perform the function of that organ. So mainly skeletal muscle tissue, but a muscle has to be connected to the central nervous system, the brain or the spinal cord, in order for it to function properly. So there has to be nervous tissue connecting to it. There's also blood. It needs blood to bring in oxygen and nutrients and to take away carbon dioxide and waste products. And then other connective tissues binding the muscles together. And we'll talk about that on the next slide more. So outside of each muscle, it is covered, by a connective tissue. And you'll see this around all organs, just like in the last chapter, bones were covered by a periosteum connective tissue. You'll see that again here. So on the very outside, so the most superficial part of a muscle, there's a layer of connective tissue. It's dense connective tissue, and we call it the fascia. It surrounds and separates each separate muscle, because many muscles do overlap with one another, and they touch other muscles and they contract separately. But if this fascia weren't here, when the muscles moved, they would cause friction on one another, and skeletal muscle is actually very delicate, so the fascia helps to protect it. The connective tissue, it goes beyond the ends of the muscle. So on the very tips of the muscle, it actually extends out, and that's what it makes a tendon. And a tendon is where the muscle is actually connected to the bone, and it fuses right into the periosteum on the bone. If you've ever, eaten like a chicken leg drumstick, the tendon, you can actually see real well. The drumstick is actually part of it's a femur, basically, of the chicken. And you could see that there's a tendon connecting it. If you've ever actually eaten one, it's kind of chewy, connecting the meat part. Meat is skeletal muscle. And then on occasion, some of the muscles are connected to one another by a broadsheet of connective tissue that's called an aponeurosis, because sometimes muscles work in tandem, like for example, your quadriceps in your thigh. They work together to produce an even stronger movement. So if we're looking at the exterior of the muscle, so the most superficial parts of the muscle, the fascia blends into the epimysium. So we're moving deeper. Fascia is on the outside, and then the epimysium. It's a connective tissue that goes around the skeletal muscle. So epi means it's on the outside, and mys is a root word that means muscle. Okay. Then if you move inwards, there are little bundles called fascicles that make up the skeletal muscle. And those fascicles are surrounded by a perimysium. So peri is in the middle and mys is muscle. And then if you move even further within each fascicle, each individual muscle cell is called a muscle fiber, and it's surrounded by a connective tissue layer called endomysium. Endo for inside, kind of like the bones had an endosteum. Okay, so here it is on the picture here. So you think of it as a bundle of tubes. So if you stack, a bunch of sticks together, and then more sticks and more sticks and more sticks, like that's how the muscle is constructed. So individually, each single muscle cell is really, really delicate, but altogether, the combined strength, is combined, they have a lot of strength. So you have, so what we're looking at, if we go in reverse order, right here, this is one muscle fiber. Sorry, this one right here, one muscle fiber. And within that muscle fiber, it's packed with pieces of cytoskeleton, okay, here, called myofibrils. And then if you zoom in even more, the myofibrils are made of filaments, microfilaments, actin and myosin, and we'll talk about that on another slide later. Okay, but a bundle of muscle fibers together makes up a fascicle. And so this whole structure that's pulled out here is a fascicle. So each of these little dots here is a muscle fiber. And then, so the muscle fiber itself, it has a plasma membrane, but around the outside of the plasma membrane is the endomysium here. Endomysium, that's what this is in between these dots. And then a bunch of muscle fibers with their endomysia all together makes up a fascicle. So each of these is a fascicle. And then surrounding those is the perimysium. And then a bunch of fascicles and their perimysia all bundled together to make up the whole muscle, which is then surrounded by an epimysium, which is then surrounded by a fascia. Okay. So they work together to do that movement in such a way that there is no friction and there is no tearing of the muscle. Although sometimes you can overextend or over-exercise a muscle and actually injure yourself. But if you're exercising safely, that's not going to happen. You can also have injuries where you tear or completely rip a tendon. That is not good. If you completely separate the tendon from the bone, you will need a surgery to put it back in the correct place. It can heal on its own, but it is not likely to heal in the correct place. And then that, wherever that is, there would be, it wouldn't heal properly. So you'd have a lack of a range of motion and maybe even pain every time you move, because it's wherever the tendon would happen to snap to that the body would make scar tissue. So if it's in the wrong place, it won't work properly. And in the meantime, until that tendon is healed, if it's completely separated, whatever that movement is not going to be able to happen, because even if the muscle contracts, it won't be pulling on a bone. If you tear it, it can heal back, but it's going to be painful and you need to not move for a while. Okay, so here's in words kind of what I was saying on the last slide. As we go in within each muscle fiber, so each muscle cell, you're going to find smaller and smaller cylindrical parts. So the muscle fiber itself, when it gets a signal from the brain, it will contract, which means it will get shorter. So it's kind of like tug of war. It'll push inwards on itself. Okay. The muscle fiber does have special terminology for its cells and cell parts. So the prefix sarco has to do with something found within a single muscle cell. So its cell membrane gets a special name called the sarcolemma. Its cytoplasm is called sarcoplasm. And it has all the things that a cell would normally have. So it has a lot of mitochondria because it needs to make a lot of ATP. It has more than one nucleus because muscle cells are really, really long. So they need that nucleus to be able to control all the different parts of the cell. They also have a specialized ER called a sarcoplasmic reticulum. I don't see that on here. It might be coming up. And then they have specialized cytoskeleton. So they have within the cytoskeleton many myofibrils, and they're all parallel to one another and arranged in bundles. And it's the myofibril that actually does the work of the contraction. So it's made up of two different proteins called actin and myosin. So the thick filaments are called myosin. So it's a lot of myosins all stacked in a line, kind of like Lego bricks. But myosin is a bigger protein, so it physically looks thicker under a microscope. And then the other protein is called actin, and it forms thin filaments. They physically look thinner under a microscope, but it's lots and lots of actin. There's also some tinier proteins called troponin and tropomyosin that are found combined with that actin, and those have to do with where the ATP and where calcium can bind to make the skeletal muscle contract. Okay. Now these two filaments are alternated with one another, and they make a pattern called a striation. So this is what basically gives the skeletal muscle its stripes. So now if we move down even smaller and just look at a myofibril itself, so this small piece of the cytoskeleton, the smallest unit of it that can make a contraction is called a sarcomere. This is a little bit complicated, like this section, but how the sarcomere is structured and how it functions is Nobel Prize winning work. Okay, it was a big deal to discover this, like biochemically, how do we move? So if you're looking at a picture, I'll show you on the next picture and then we'll come back. If you're looking on this picture, this zigzag line is called a Z line. So thankfully that name makes sense. But the distance from one Z line to one Z line, this is what defines a sarcomere. Okay, so this, you do need to know the anatomy of this picture. Okay, so here in the middle, you see a thick filament, and then these thin blue lines are the thin filaments. So here's the myosin, here's the actin. And what will happen is during a muscle contraction, these blue lines will move inward until they nearly touch. Okay, the myosin is going to stay still, but the whole muscle will like squish inwards, kind of like an accordion. But if you look at when the muscle is relaxed, this area in the middle, you just see thick filaments. So that's called the H zone. Okay, right in the middle. And then this area where they overlap, okay, we've got the I band here on the ends, and then where it's just the thin filament, sorry, and where they overlap, that's the A band. So when the muscle is contracted, the A band area actually shrinks down and the H zone disappears. To the last slide. So the I bands are just the actin filaments. The A bands is where the actin and the myosin, the thick and the thin, overlap. And then the H zone is in the middle. So it's just myosin. Okay, and then the M line is actually the very center of the sarcomere in the center of the H zone. And then there are some different proteins that hold the myosin, like they anchor it in place within the cell so that the whole thing doesn't move. So this picture is a slide of an actual muscle fiber, like a myofibril, if you zoom in, so you can see almost exactly. Now, it's not this color in real life. We've stained it. In real life, it's kind of pinkish because of most of our tissue is kind of pinkish from blood. Okay, but this is what it looks like. Okay, so if you flatten it out, it looks like this, and then here it is a little bit more stylized. Now we're going to zoom out for just a little bit, and we're talking about the skeletal muscle fiber as a whole. So the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber, so just under the sarcolemma, just deep to it, is a specialized ER, endoplasmic reticulum. It's called a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's specialized in that, here it looks like this. Here's the SR. So instead of being like a flattened kind of tube-like highway, like we learned about in one of the earlier chapters, it's still tube-like, but it's flattened around the myofibrils, and it'll go around each of the myofibrils. If you look at the tubes here, you can kind of see that same animation here on the end where there's a cross section. Okay, it actually does touch the sarcolemma, and it runs around all of the myofibrils up and down the length of the muscle fiber. And it's connected with the sarcolemma via these P tubules. They're called transverse tubules. They go perpendicular to it. And this is important because these membranes have to connect to pass along the nervous system signal for contraction, basically. The T tubules do open to the outside of the muscle fibers. So they are connected to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? Open to the outside. When muscle contraction happens, the T tubules are what activates that contraction. So it has to do with calcium ions and a movement back and forth of that, but we can get to that later. So skeletal muscle fibers only contract when a motor neuron tells them to. They get stimulated. Unless they're being stimulated by an outside electrical source, like if you shock yourself, part of the reason why it hurts is your muscles contract involuntarily because the electricity is forcing them to contract. That's the same reasoning behind why a TENS unit works, except the electrical signal is very low in a TENS unit. But what will happen is the muscle fiber makes a synapse with a motor neuron. So neurons make synapses with one another in the nervous system, but we also have a synapse here where they reach the muscle. They don't actually touch. They come close to one another, but they don't actually touch. And in fact, the more you practice a movement, like if you play a sport or an instrument, the closer they will physically get, making that muscle easier to fire in the future, easier to contract. And that's what we would call a muscle memory. But it takes practice. If you don't practice, they'll grow a little bit further apart. The neuron will tell the skeletal muscle fiber to contract by using neurotransmitters, just like neurons talk to other neurons with neurotransmitters. It is a chemical, the physical thing that has to go from the neuron across the gap, and the gap is called the neuromuscular junction. And then it has to hit the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. And the specific neurotransmitter in this case is called acetylcholine, and we abbreviate it ACH. Let me show you the picture before I go into that. So this would be the neuron. Here it is. Okay, and if we zoom in, so we've got the neuron and the muscle fiber. So they're not actually connecting, but they're close. Inside the neuron, these are vesicles that would have the neurotransmitters. It's called acetylcholine. There it is spelled out. They have to diffuse across and physically hit the sarcolemma and trigger an action potential within the muscle. If you've had psychology, or you probably know that term, but we will come back to it. Okay, and then once that process happens and the action potential is triggered, that signals the release of calcium into all the T tubules, which triggers the muscle to contract. So the motor neuron, in the end of it, it has a lot of mitochondria because it needs a lot of energy to do this action, to make the muscles contract. And it has the synaptic vesicles. So it's just a vesicle that has the neurotransmitter in it. It's synaptic because it's found at the synapse. This area where the end of the motor neuron makes this synapse is called the motor end plate. On that sarcolemma, there are specialized receptors. So there's special proteins that are shaped to match the acetylcholine. So they're there to just receive the message. When the electrical impulse from either the brain or the spinal cord reaches the end of that motor neuron's axon, that triggers the synaptic vesicles to release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, the gap. Acetylcholine has to diffuse across that gap, and then it will bind to the protein receptors on the sarcolemma on the other side of the motor end plate. That causes an action potential, and that triggers the muscle fiber to contract. There's a lot of biochemistry involved in here, and we don't have to get that specific at this level. But it does involve the movement of these neurotransmitters and the movement of calcium ions, which is why calcium is so important in the body, why the bones store it up. Because if you do not have calcium, you cannot move. Okay, at some point, you would be unable to move. It is necessary for muscle contraction. Okay, and I'm actually going to stop here for today. We'll pick up with more specifics on muscle contraction in lecture 2.